I have lived long enough to notice how people measure each other by the strangest things: the cut of a dress, the shape of a body, the name someone's father left behind. And I have noticed, too, that the ones who get dismissed the quickest are often the ones who have the most to give. This story reminded me of that truth, in a way I have never forgotten. The door shut before Clara could finish her sentence. She stood at the back entrance of the saloon, the cook's laughter still hanging in the air. Her hands found her apron, twisted the fabric until her knuckles went white. 17 years she had spent learning to cook at her father's side. 3 months she had spent being turned away. She did not go back to the livery stable where the landlord waited with his ledger. She did not walk past the general store where Mrs. Harmon's voice carried through the window something about the Danby girl, something about her father drinking himself into the grave. Clara walked toward the edge of town, where the road turned to dust and the mountains rose in the distance. In her pocket, a torn newspaper scrap, months old, yellow at the edges. Silas Croy, Bear Ridge, supplies wanted. Nobody went up there anymore. But Clara had 17 cents, a carpet bag held together with twine, and hands that knew how to turn flour into something worth remembering. The ridge waited, 7 miles up. The wagon trail ended at mile 3. Clara stood where the ruts disappeared into a wall of pine and wild grass. Her boots resoled twice. Split now at the left seam, sank into soft earth. She shifted the carpet bag to her other hand. The twine holding the broken clasp dug into her palm, leaving a red line across the skin. No markers, no signs, just the ridge line above, half hidden by spruce and morning haze. She climbed. The deer path wound upward through shadows that smelled of pine pitch and rotting needles. Branches caught her sleeves, pulled threads loose from her calico dress. Sweat gathered at the small of her back, soaked through the fabric, until it clung against her skin with every step. Her breath came harder, shorter. At what she guessed was the 4th mile, the path vanished entirely. Clara stopped, hands on her knees, chest heaving. Her stockings had worn through at both heels. Each step ground dirt and pine needles against raw skin, and she had stopped feeling the sting an hour ago. Now there was only numbness and the dull throb beneath it. She looked up. The ridge seemed no closer than it had at dawn. A creek appeared through the trees, narrow and cold and clear. Clara dropped to her knees at the bank, cupped water to her mouth. It tasted of stone and snow melt and something clean she had almost forgotten existed. She unlaced her boots, peeled off the ruined stockings. Her feet were blistered at the balls, angry red welts rising where the leather had rubbed for 7 miles. She soaked them anyway. The cold bit deep, then numbed. From her carpet bag, she pulled her last biscuit, dry, crumbling at the edges. She ate it slowly, letting each piece soften on her tongue before swallowing. Across the creek, a doe watched her, ears forward, eyes dark and unblinking. No fear in that gaze, no recognition either. Nothing human had passed this way in a long time. Clara pulled her feet from the water. The blisters screamed when she forced them back into the split boots. She stood, shouldered her bag, and kept climbing. She used tree roots as handholds now, pulling herself up slopes too steep for walking. Her dress tore at the hem. Her fingernails broke against bark. Then smoke, thin and gray, threading through the spruce trees above. Clara's hands stilled on the root she was gripping. Through the branches, something took shape. Cedar shingles, weathered silver, a low roof, a sagging porch, and on that porch, a figure. watching her. Clara pulled herself over the final rise and stood at the edge of the clearing. The cabin sat low against the ridge, built half into the slope like it had grown there. Cedar shingles gone silver with decades of weather. A chimney of stacked riverstone. Smoke curling thin from its throat. The porch sagged at one corner, boards warped and nails pushing up through the wood. The man on that porch did not move. 60 years of weather lived in his face. Deep lines carved around eyes the color of creek water in winter. A beard that reached his chest, more gray than brown, tangled at the ends where he had stopped caring. He wore a wool shirt, patched at both elbows, different cloth, different thread, neither matching. A rifle rested in the crook of his arm, not aimed, just present. Clara's legs burned from the climb. Her torn dress hung limp with sweat. She could feel her heart beating against the inside of her throat, too fast and too loud. She spoke first. "I can cook." The words came out thin. Worn down by 7 miles of climbing and 3 months of being turned away. She swallowed against the dryness in her throat and tried again. "I can cook. That's why I'm here." The man's eyes moved over her. Not her body, her face. Her hands. The carpet bag held together with twine. The boots split at the seams, stuffed with rags where the leather had given out. He said nothing. Wind moved through the spruce trees behind her, somewhere distant. A bird called and received no answer. "I saw your notice," Clara said. "In the newspaper. Months back." Still nothing. His expression gave away less than the stone chimney behind him. Clara's fingers tightened on the carpetbag strap. The twine bit into the raw line it had already worn across her palm. "I'm not asking for charity. 1 week, no pay, just a roof and whatever food there is. If you don't want my cooking after 7 days, I leave. No argument." No. The silence stretched. She could hear her own breathing, ragged and too fast, could smell wood smoke and pine, and something else underneath the sour tang of old bacon grease, of a kitchen long neglected. The man's gaze held hers for a count of 5. 10. Then he turned his head slightly, looking past her toward the trail she had climbed. "You came up alone." Not a question. His voice sounded rusted, unused, like hinges on a door that had not been opened in years. "Yes." Another silence. He shifted the rifle, moved it to his other arm. The motion was slow, deliberate, like a man testing whether his own muscles still remembered what to do. "Smokehouse is empty," he said. "Pantry's got flour, salt, dried beans." He turned toward the cabin door. "Make something?" The door swung inward. He stepped through without looking back. Clara stood in the clearing, her blistered feet throbbing inside her broken boots. The open doorway waited, dark and silent. Wind pushed against her back, cold now that the sun had dropped behind the ridge. She had asked for 1 week. She walked toward that darkness, toward the smell of cold ash and neglect, and stepped inside. The kitchen was smaller than she had imagined. A wood stove black with years of use, a rough-hewn table with 1 chair, tin plates stacked by a basin that needed scrubbing, and hanging by the window, catching the last of the daylight wild onions, braided and dry. Clara set down her carpet bag, reached into her pocket and touched the folded paper she had carried since Ridgway, her father's death certificate, signed by Dr. Marsden, dated August 23rd. She did not know why she had brought it. did not know why she could not leave it behind. She let it go and rolled up her sleeves. The stove door opened with a groan of old hinges. Clara fed kindling to the cold firebox, struck a match from the tin on the shelf. The flame caught, grew, began to breathe. Behind her, the man settled into the chair at the table. She heard the creak of wood under his weight, felt his eyes on her back. She did not turn around. The bacon grease in the rusted tin had gone hard and white. The flour barrel held weevil tracks on top, but the flour beneath looked clean enough. The beans sat in a burlap sack, dark and smooth. Clara's hands moved without thought, measuring, mixing, kneading. The stove warmed. The grease softened in the pan. Steam began to rise. 7 days. She had 7 days to prove that her hands were worth more than her reflection in a mirror. The first biscuit hit the hot pan with a hiss. Clara pressed it flat with her palm, felt the heat rise against her skin. Outside, the ridge fell away into darkness. The trail she had climbed was invisible now, swallowed by night and trees and distance. And somewhere below, Ridgway slept without knowing she was gone, without knowing what she was about to become. Clara woke to the smell of cold ash and pine. Gray light pressed through the single window of the storage room. She lay on a corn husk mattress that crinkled with every breath. Her body stiff from yesterday's climb, her feet still throbbing inside the bandages she had wrapped before sleep took her. The cabin was silent. She pushed herself up, fingers finding the rough wool blanket the old man had left outside her door, without a word. Her dress hung on a nail by the window, the hem still damp where she had tried to scrub out the mud and the pine sap. She pulled it on, feeling the cold fabric settle against her skin, like a second layer of mourning. The main room was empty. The chair at the table sat pushed back, and the tin plate from last night's supper rested beside the basin. Clara crossed to it, lifted it toward the pale light from the window, scraped clean. Not a bean left. Not a crumb of biscuit. She set the plate in the basin and turned to the stove. The fire had died to embers overnight, a faint glow buried under gray ash. She fed it kindling first, blew gently until flames caught, then added 2 splits of pine from the stack by the door. The wood was dry and seasoned. It caught fast and burned hot. Coffee first. She found the tin pot with its handle wrapped in leather strips, filled it from the water bucket, measured grounds from a canvas sack that smelled of age and something that might once have been freshness. The water began to bubble. Steam rose, carrying that bitter, dark scent through the cabin. Then biscuits. Her hands moved without thought. Flour. Salt. A scoop of the bacon grease that had softened overnight by the warming stove. She worked the dough until it held together, patted it flat on the worn cutting board, cut rounds with the rim of a tin cup. The pan hissed when she laid them in. Outside, the steady rhythm of an axe biting wood. Clara moved to the window and looked through the wavy glass. Croy stood at the woodpile, 50 yards from the cabin. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow despite the morning chill, his movements economical and precise. Each swing split the log clean down the center. He stacked the halves without pausing, reached for the next piece, swung again. He did not look toward the cabin. Yumzet. Clara turned back to the stove. The biscuits were browning at the edges, golden where the heat touched them first. She flipped each one, pressed them flat with the back of a fork. The salt pork she had found in a brine crock yesterday, she sliced it thin now, laid the strips in a second pan. The fat began to render immediately, filling the kitchen with a smell that was rich and heavy and real. When everything was ready, she set the table. 2 tin plates this time, 2 kiki, 2 cups of coffee, black and steaming. She went to the door and opened it. Croy was walking toward the cabin, axe over one shoulder. He saw her in the doorway and slowed his pace. His eyes moved past her to the table inside, to the steam rising from the plates. He said nothing. He climbed the porch steps, leaned the axe against the wall by the door, and sat at the table. Clara sat across from him in the chair she had found in the storage room that morning and dragged out without asking. They ate in silence. Clara watched him from the corner of her eye while pretending to focus on her own plate. He chewed slowly, methodically, like a man who had forgotten that eating could be anything other than fuel. He took a sip of coffee, set the cup down, picked up another biscuit. His face gave away nothing. When his plate was empty, he pushed it toward the center of the table, stood, walked to the door. Then he paused. "Chickens need feeding," he said without turning around. "Coop's behind the smokehouse." The door closed behind him. Clara sat alone at the table, the taste of coffee still warm on her tongue. 2 words more than yesterday. A task, a direction. She gathered the plates and carried them to the basin. The water from the bucket was cold against her hands. She scrubbed the tin with a rag that had seen better years, watching through the window as Croy returned to the woodpile. The axe rose and fell, the rhythm steady as a heartbeat. When the dishes were clean and drying on the shelf, she untied her apron and stepped outside. The morning air hit her face, cool and sharp with the smell of pine and wood smoke. She followed the packed dirt path around the side of the cabin, past the smokehouse with its door hanging crooked on leather hinges. The chicken coop stood at the edge of the tree line, small, weathered. The wire fencing had rusted in patches, mended here and there with twists of newer wire that caught the light. 3 hens pecked at the dirt inside the enclosure, brown feathers, red combs, black eyes that tracked her movement as she approached. Clara found the feed bucket hanging from a nail on the coop wall, half full of cracked corn gone stale but still good enough. She scattered handfuls through the gaps in the wire, watched the hens fight each other for the kernels. Beyond the coop, something else caught her eye. The remains of a garden. Fence posts still standing, weathered gray, but the wire between them had collapsed in places, and weeds had risen hip-high within the boundary, gone to seed and tangled together, buried beneath the chaos. Clara could see the bones of what had once been raised beds, tomato stakes, rotting, bean poles, fallen and forgotten. Someone had tended this once. Someone had cared. She walked the perimeter slowly, pushing weeds aside with her boot. Dead squash vines crumbled at her touch. Potato plants had gone wild, their leaves yellowed and spotted with disease. And beneath all the chaos, dark soil, rich, damp, waiting. Clara crouched, pressed her fingers into the earth. It was cool and crumbled easily in her palm. Good soil. The kind her father had taught her to recognize before the drinking took everything else away. She looked back toward the cabin. Croy was still at the woodpile, his back to her, the axe swinging in its steady arc. He had not asked her to touch the garden, had not mentioned it at all, but Clara's hands were already figuring. What could be salvaged? What could be cleared? What might grow again if someone cared enough to try? She stood, brushed the dirt from her fingers. The root cellar door was set into the slope behind the garden. Wooden planks gone gray with age, a rusted iron ring for a handle. Clara pulled, The hinges groaned, and a smell rose up from the darkness below earth and cold, and something sweet turning toward rot. She descended 3 stone steps into the cool. Potatoes lined one wall, piled in wooden bins. Most had sprouted white eyes that reached toward nothing, tangled together in the dark. But beneath the twisted growth, some were still firm, still usable. Clara gathered what she could carry in her apron, climbed back into the light. When she returned to the cabin, she found a hoe leaning against the back wall near the wood pile. The handle was smooth with years of use, the blade nicked in places but still sharp enough to cut. She carried it to the garden and began to work. The sun climbed. Sweat gathered at her temples, ran down her neck and into her collar. Her shoulders burned. Her blistered feet screamed inside her boots with every step, every push of the hoe into resistant soil. She kept working. By midday, she had cleared a quarter of the plot. The raised beds emerged from beneath the weeds, their wooden frames still solid despite the rot at the corners. Good bones. That's what her father would have said, back when he still said anything at all. Clara straightened, pressed her hands against the small of her aching back. Croy stood at the edge of the clearing, watching her. The axe rested at his feet. His expression was impossible to read from this distance, but his eyes stayed on the garden for a long moment. Then he turned and walked toward the cabin without speaking. Clara noticed something she had not seen before. The woodpile behind him was 3 times the size it had been that morning. She looked at the cleared earth beneath her feet, looked at the cabin, where smoke was rising from the chimney she had stoked before dawn. 2 people working, apart but aware, circling each other like animals, not yet sure if the other meant harm or help. Clara picked up the hoe and bent back to the soil. The afternoon passed in rhythm. Pull, chop, clear. Stack the dead vines at the edge of the plot. Move to the next row. Repeat. When the light began to fade, and her arms refused to lift the hoe again, she walked back to the cabin. Croy sat at the table, sharpening a knife on a whetstone. The sound filled the small room, metal against stone, steady and deliberate as everything else he did. He did not look up when she entered. Clara washed her hands in the basin, found the potatoes she had salvaged from the cellar, scrubbed the dirt from their skins until they shone pale and clean. Soup tonight. Simple. Warm. Something to fill the silence. She quartered the potatoes, dropped them into the pot of water already warming on the stove. From the rafters, she pulled the dried sage she had noticed yesterday, dusty and forgotten, but still fragrant when she crushed it between her fingers. A handful of beans she had set to soak that morning, salt from the cracked bowl on the shelf. The kitchen filled with steam. When she ladled the soup into Croy's bowl, he took the first spoonful, lifted it halfway to his mouth, then stopped. His hand hung in the air. The spoon hovered an inch from his lips. He looked at the soup, then at her, then back at the soup. Something shifted in his face. Not a smile, she was not sure he remembered how. But the hard line of his jaw loosened. Just slightly. The permanent furrow between his brows eased by a fraction. He took the bite, chewed, swallowed. Then he reached for the ladle and filled his bowl again without asking. Clara ate her own portion slowly, watching the last light fade outside the window. The ridge had turned gold and rose with the setting sun. Somewhere in the trees beyond the clearing, an owl began its evening call. When Croy finished his second bowl, he set it down with a sound that was almost gentle. Cellar needs organizing, he said, his voice still rough from disuse. Beans are mixed with the corn. Hard to find anything. He stood, took his rifle from the hook by the door, and walked out into the dusk. Clara gathered the bowls and washed them in the cold water. Dried them with the rag that was starting to feel familiar in her hands. 3 tasks now: chickens, garden, cellar. She hung the rag on its nail and looked around the kitchen. The stove glowed with banked coals. The sage hung crooked from its rafter hook. She straightened it without thinking. Tomorrow she would organize the cellar, check the chicken coop for eggs, clear more of the garden. Tomorrow she would cook again. Clara walked to her small room, lay down on the corn husk mattress, and listened to the silence of the ridge settle around her like a blanket. Just before sleep pulled her under. She heard footsteps on the porch, soft, deliberate. Then a quiet thump against the cabin wall. Her eyes opened. She rose, crossed the dark main room on bare feet, and opened the front door. On the porch boards, where nothing had been before, lay a rabbit, fresh caught, still warm. Clara looked out into the darkness. The tree line was black against a sky full of stars. She could not see Croy, could not hear his footsteps retreating down any trail. But she understood. She picked up the rabbit, carried it inside, and began preparing it for tomorrow's stew. Day 1 was done. 6 more remained. And somewhere beneath the exhaustion and the aching muscles and the blisters that were finally beginning to heal, Clara felt something she had not felt in months. The faint and terrifying flicker of hope. The hoofbeats came on the 8th day. Clara was in the garden, pulling the last of the dead squash vines from the soil, when she heard them, distant at first, muffled by the thick stands of pine, then louder, closer, the unmistakable rhythm of 2 horses climbing the ridge trail. She straightened, her hands caked with dirt, and looked toward the tree line. Croy emerged from the cabin before she could move. He stood on the porch with his rifle in his hands, watching the trail with eyes that had gone flat and hard. His jaw was set, his shoulders squared. 2 riders broke through the spruce at the edge of the clearing. The first was older, maybe 50, with a face weathered by decades of sun and wind and a bad leg that stuck out stiff in the stirrup. The second was younger, 17 or 18 at most, with the same jaw, the same slope to his shoulders. Father and nephew, Clara guessed. Or uncle and nephew. Something in the blood connected them. The older man raised a hand as they approached the cabin. "Silas Croy," he called out. "Been a long time." Croy did not lower the rifle. "Frank Morrow." "Easy now." Frank swung down from his saddle, favoring the bad leg. He landed heavy, grimaced at the impact, and steadied himself against his horse's flank. "We're not here for trouble. Got caught in weather 2 ridges over. Looking for shelter. Maybe a meal if you've got one to spare." His eyes moved past Croy to Clara, standing in the half-cleared garden with dirt on her apron and sweat drying in her hair. "Didn't know you had company?" Croy said nothing. His gaze stayed on Frank for a long moment, then shifted to the younger man still mounted on his horse. "My nephew," Frank said. "Danny. He's harmless." Danny touched the brim of his hat in Clara's direction. His face was open and curious, too young to know how to hide what he was thinking. The silence stretched. Clara could feel the tension in it. Could see the way Croy's hands had tightened on the rifle stock. His knuckles had gone white. Then Croy lowered the barrel, not all the way, just enough. "One night," he said, "you supply the meat." Frank reached back to his saddlebag and pulled out a canvas-wrapped bundle. The shape was unmistakable, even from where Clara stood. Venison, fresh enough that she could smell the iron tang of blood, even from 20 feet away. "Brought our own," Frank said. "Figured we might need to bargain." Croy jerked his head toward the cabin. Inside, Clara watched the two men lead their horses toward the small lean-to behind the smokehouse. Danny kept glancing back at her as they walked. His expression caught somewhere between curiosity and confusion. She could read the question on his face. What is she doing here? She wiped her hands on her apron and walked toward the cabin to start cooking. The kitchen was hers now. She knew it the way she knew her own heartbeat, the stove's temperament. Which side of the firebox ran hotter? The cutting board's worn groove where 1,000 knives had rested before hers. The exact spot where the afternoon light fell through the window and warmed the flour barrel just enough to keep the damp away. She unwrapped the venison on the table. Good meat, lean and clean. Clara found her rhythm. She cut the venison into chunks, browned them in the cast iron skillet with rendered fat from the bacon she had been saving. The meat hissed and spat, filling the cabin with a smell that made her own stomach clench with hunger. She added water from the bucket, potatoes from the cellar, carrots that Frank had pulled from his saddlebag as an afterthought, wild onions from the window, the last of the dried sage from the rafters. The stew began to simmer. The men gathered in the main room while she worked. Croy sat in his usual chair, the one closest to the door, his rifle propped against the wall within arm's reach. Frank took the chair that Clara had claimed as her own, and Danny sat on an overturned crate that Croy had kicked toward him without a word of explanation. They talked. Not much, and not about anything that mattered. Clara stirred the stew and listened. When the meat was tender and the broth had thickened with the starch from the potatoes, she ladled it into bowls. 4 of them tin plates she had scrubbed clean that morning without knowing she would need them. She served Frank first, then Danny, then Croy. Her own bowl she filled last, and she ate standing by the stove with her back against the warm wall. Frank took his first bite, chewed, stopped. His spoon hung in the air. Forgotten. He looked at the stew in his bowl, then at Clara, then at Croy. "Well," he said, just that one word, drawn out long and slow. Danny had already finished half his portion, eating with the desperate speed of a young man who had been living on trail rations for too many days. But at his uncle's voice, he paused and looked up. "Where'd you find her?" Frank asked Croy. Croy did not answer. He was eating his own stew with the same slow deliberation Clara had come to expect, his eyes on the bowl, his expression giving nothing away. Frank shook his head and went back to eating. He scraped his bowl clean with the edge of a biscuit, then looked at Clara. "Any more of that?" She filled his bowl again. "And Danny's?" And when Croy pushed his empty plate toward the center of the table without asking, she filled his too. The evening settled around them like a blanket. The light through the windows turned gold, then orange, then faded slowly to gray. Frank told a story about a bear he had tracked 3 summers ago, how the animal had led him in circles for 2 days before he realized it was tracking him back. Danny laughed at the right moments. Croy did not laugh, but the hard line of his shoulders had eased, and the rifle stayed propped against the wall. When the bowls were empty and the fire in the stove had burned down to glowing coals, Frank leaned back in his chair and stretched. "We'll head out at first light," he said. "But I'm thinking we might come back this way before the season's done, if there's more of that stew waiting." Croy looked at Clara. A long look, unreadable as always. "She'll be here," he said. The words dropped into the silence like stones into still water. Clara's hand stilled on the rag she was using to wipe down the table. "She'll be here. Not maybe. Not we'll see." She looked at Croy, but he had already turned away, reaching for his pipe on the shelf above the fireplace. Danny cleared his throat. "Ma'am," Clara turned. The boy was holding his empty bowl, but his eyes were on something else, a scrap of brown paper in his other hand, and the pencil stub he had found somewhere. "Those biscuits from earlier," he said. "The ones you made with supper. My ma back home, she'd want that recipe. If you'd be willing to share it." Clara took the paper from his hand, found the pencil. She wrote the recipe in careful letters, the way her father had taught her to write before the drinking took his steadiness and everything else. Flour, salt, bacon grease, the amount of water, the temperature of the pan, the time to let them brown. She folded the paper and handed it back. Danny took it like she had given him something precious. He tucked it inside his shirt, against his chest, and nodded once. "Thank you kindly. Ma'am?" Frank stood, stretched again, grimaced at his bad leg. "We'll sleep in the lean-to with the horses. No need to trouble you for bedding." The two men filed out into the darkness. Clara heard their boots on the porch boards, then the crunch of gravel as they walked toward the smokehouse. Croy remained at the table, his pipe unlit in his hand. He turned it over slowly, examining the bowl, the stem, the small crack near the mouthpiece that he had mended with something that looked like pine pitch. Clara finished wiping down the table, hung the rag on its nail by the basin, banked the coals in the stove for the night. When she turned to go to her room, Croy spoke. "Used to be," he said quietly. "Nobody came up here." Clara waited. Her hand rested on the door frame of her small room. The firelight caught the deep lines of his face, carved shadows around his eyes, and in the hollows of his cheeks. He was still turning the pipe over in his hands, not looking at her. Might be different now. He stood, walked to the door, and stepped out onto the porch. Clara heard the scrape of his boots on the boards, then nothing but the wind in the spruce trees. She stood alone in the kitchen, the smell of venison stew still hanging thick in the air. Might be different now. 8 days ago. She had climbed this ridge with 17 cents and a carpetbag held shut with twine. 8 days ago, she had been nobody. Less than nobody, just the fat daughter of the town drunk. Not worth the trouble of a second glance. Now Frank Morrow was promising to return. Danny was carrying her recipe pressed against his heart. And Silas Croy, the man who had not spoken a full sentence to anyone in years, was talking about a future. Clara walked to the window and looked out at the darkness beyond the glass. Somewhere down that ridge, Ridgway slept. The general store where Ms. Harmon had whispered about her. The saloon where the cook had laughed. The livery stable where Silas Greer had given her until Friday to pay or leave. They did not know where she was. Did not know what she was becoming. And standing in this kitchen that smelled of sage and wood smoke and her own making, Clara realized something that stopped her breath. She did not want them to know. She did not want to go back. Not ever. The thought was new, sharp, terrifying in its certainty. Clara pressed her palm flat against the cold glass and felt something shift deep in her chest, something that might have been the first crack in the wall she had built around herself. Then, from somewhere far down the ridge, she heard hoofbeats. More than 2 horses this time. 3 at least. Maybe 4. Moving fast. Clara's hand dropped from the window. Her heart began to pound against her ribs. Frank and Danny were in the lean-to. Croy was on the porch. So who else was climbing the ridge in the dark? The hoofbeats faded before they reached the clearing. Clara stood frozen by the window, her breath fogging the cold glass. Outside, Croy had come down from the porch, his rifle raised and ready. Frank emerged from the lean-to barefoot and rumpled, squinting into the darkness beyond the tree line. They waited. The ridge held its breath. Then nothing. The sound had turned back somewhere on the trail below lost hunters, perhaps, who realized their mistake and headed down toward the valley instead of up toward the unknown. Happens sometimes, Frank said the next morning, tightening his saddle cinch before leaving. Folks get turned around in the dark. Nothing to worry over. But Clara noticed how Croy watched the trail long after Frank and Danny had disappeared down the ridge. And she noticed how he kept his rifle closer for the next 3 days. The weeks that followed blurred into rhythm. Spring gave way to summer. The garden Clara had cleared and replanted began to show green bean shoots climbing the poles she had cut and lashed together. Tomato plants spreading their leaves toward the sun. Squash vines crawling across the dark soil she had turned with her own hands. The seedlings she had found half dead in the neglected beds had taken root again, stronger now with care. Croy fixed the sagging corner of the porch without being asked. One morning Clara woke to the sound of hammering, and by noon the boards lay flat and solid, the rusty nails replaced with new ones he had traded for somewhere she did not ask about. More visitors came as word spread through the high country. Ezekiel arrived first, a trapper with a white beard stained yellow around the mouth and hands that shook when they were not holding something. He brought beaver pelts to trade and stayed for 2 bowls of rabbit stew. Then a prospector named Holt, heading for the gold country higher up, who paid for his supper with a small sack of coffee beans that smelled fresher than anything Clara had touched since leaving Ridgeway. A family heading west stopped for a night and stayed for 2, their children sleeping on blankets by the stove while their parents talked quietly with Croy about the trails ahead. Each visitor left something behind: coffee, flour, sugar, a length of blue calico that Clara turned into curtains for her window. Clara started keeping a ledger. Not of money, she had none. And neither did most of the people who climbed this far, but of trades and names and dates. The leather-bound book had been buried in a drawer in Croy's cabin, unused for years, its pages blank and waiting. Midsummer came with long days that stretched toward 10 o'clock before the light finally failed. Clara's garden flourished in the warmth, beans ready for picking, tomatoes ripening on the vine, squash spreading their broad leaves across the soil she had reclaimed from neglect. She was tying up tomato vines on a hot afternoon when the rider appeared. A woman this time. Alone. Sitting straight in the saddle of a bay mare that gleamed with health and expensive care. Her clothes were finer than anything Clara had seen since leaving town, a riding habit of dark green wool. Boots that had never known a day of hard labor. A hat that cost more than everything Clara owned put together. Clara straightened, wiped her dirty hands on her apron. The woman rode to the edge of the clearing and stopped. Her eyes moved over the cabin, the garden. Clara herself assessing, calculating, missing nothing. "You're the cook," she said. Not a question. I'm Margaret Holloway. My husband owns the ranch in the valley." She paused, as if this information should mean something significant. When Clara did not respond, she continued. "I've heard about your work, from Ruth Patterson, from Frank Morrow, from half the people who've passed through this ridge in the last month." Clara waited. The tomato vine she had been tying hung limp in her hand, forgotten. "My daughter is getting married," Margaret said. 6 weeks from now, I want a cake from..." Clara's fingers tightened on the vine. "A cake. A real cake. 3 tears. Something she'll remember for the rest of her life." Margaret's gaze was sharp, measuring, giving nothing away for free. "Can you do it?" The question hung in the summer air. Clara thought of the kitchen behind her, the cast-iron stove with its temperamental firebox, the tin plates and dented pans, the flour barrel that was running low again. She had never made a wedding cake, had never made anything with 3 tiers, had never made anything for someone who expected it to be perfect. "I can try," she said. "Trying isn't good enough. I need to know you can do it." Croy's voice came from the porch. Clara had not heard him approach. "She can do it." Margaret turned in her saddle to look at him. Croy stood with his arms crossed over his chest, his face as unreadable as always. But there was something in his stance that Clara had not seen before, a certainty, a confidence that had nothing to do with himself. "She can do it," he said again. "Bring your ingredients." Margaret looked from Croy to Clara and back again. Her expression shifted skepticism, giving way to something that might have been respect, or at least curiosity about this strange pair living alone on the ridge. "I'll send supplies up next week," she said finally. "Flour, sugar, butter, eggs, everything you'll need." She gathered her reins and turned the bay mare back toward the trail. "My daughter's name is Eleanor. She's marrying a good man from the valley. Make it something worthy of that." She rode away without waiting for an answer. Clara stood in the garden, her hands still tangled in the tomato vines, watching the bay mare disappear down the trail. A wedding cake, 3 tiers, for the daughter of the richest rancher in the valley. Her stomach turned with something that was not quite fear and not quite excitement. She had never made anything like this, had never been asked to make something that mattered so much to someone she would never meet. But Croy had said she could do it, had said it without hesitation, without doubt, like it was simply a fact that everyone should already know. She looked at the cabin, at the kitchen window with its new blue curtains moving gently in the summer breeze, at the garden she had planted, the chickens she fed each morning, the life she had built from nothing but determination and 2 skilled hands. The supplies arrived 5 days later, carried up the ridge by a quiet man on a mule who said nothing except, "Mrs. Holloway sent this," before turning around and heading back down. 2 barrels of flour, finer than anything Clara had ever touched. A crate of eggs packed carefully in straw. Fresh butter wrapped in cheesecloth and kept cool in the shade. Sugar, white and pure, in a canvas sack. Clara had never seen so much at once. She spent 3 days planning before she touched any of it, drew diagrams on brown paper, calculated amounts and temperatures and timing, mixed small test batches of batter, baked them in the tin cups she used for measuring, tasted and adjusted, and started over. The first attempt was too dense, heavy as a brick. The second was too dry, crumbling when she tried to lift it from the pan. The third rose beautifully, but fell in the center, leaving a crater that no amount of cutting could fix. Croy ate every failed attempt without complaint. On the 3rd morning, he set down his fork and looked at her across the table. "You'll figure it," he said, and went back to eating. On the 4th day, Clara found her answer. More eggs, less sugar. Butter worked longer and harder until it turned pale and light. She baked a single layer and held her breath as she turned it out onto the cutting board. It held. Golden brown on the outside, soft and tender within, with a fine crumb that did not fall apart when she cut into it. She closed her eyes and tasted it. Yes, the full cake took 2 more days to complete. 3 tiers, each baked separately in the largest pans she could find, cooled on racks she fashioned from wire and wood. She leveled each layer with a knife she had sharpened herself, then spread wild berry preserves between them, dark and sweet, made from berries she had gathered at the edge of the forest and cooked down with sugar until they thickened. The final tier went on last. Clara's hands trembled as she lifted it, placed it carefully on top of the others. For a moment it teetered, and her heart stopped beating. Then it settled, steady and true. She stepped back. The cake stood on the table like something from another world. 3 tiers of golden perfection. Dark preserves visible at the seams between layers. The whole thing dusted with a fine powder of sugar she had ground by hand with a mortar and pestle borrowed from the root cellar. It was not elegant in the way a city baker's cake would be elegant. It was not decorated with frosting flowers or delicate designs. But it was hers. Made with her hands, her skill, her refusal to give up. Margaret Holloway arrived the next morning with a wagon to carry the cake down to the valley. She climbed down from the seat, walked into the cabin, and stopped. For a long moment, she said nothing, just stood there, looking at the cake on the table. Then she turned to Clara, and her eyes were wet. "My daughter," she said quietly. "She'll remember this." She took Clara's hands in her own rough hands, both of them, cracked and calloused from work, and held them. "Thank you." Clara did not know what to say. The words stuck somewhere in her chest, tangled with feelings she could not name, so she just nodded, the way Croy had taught her. Simple acknowledgement. Nothing more needed. Margaret paid in gold coin. 3 of them. Bright and heavy in Clara's palm. More money than she had ever held at once in her life. She tried to refuse the supplies, had been expensive. The work had been hard. But surely not this much. But Margaret pressed the coins into her hand and closed her fingers around them. "You earned this," Margaret said. "Every cent." The wagon rolled away with the cake nestled carefully in straw, covered with white muslin to keep the dust off. Clara watched it disappear down the ridge trail, her hand still closed tight around the gold. That evening, Croy sat on the porch with his pipe. Clara brought him coffee and settled into her own chair, the one with the cushion she had sewn from the blue calico, the one that now felt like it had always been hers. They sat in silence, watching the ridge darken as the sun dropped behind the mountains. "You did good," Croy said. 3 words. The most direct praise he had ever given her. Clara looked at the coins in her lap, then at the garden. Green and thriving in the fading light. Then at the man beside her. Smoke curling from his pipe. His weathered face turned toward the sunset. "I couldn't have done it," she said. "If you hadn't let me stay." Croy did not answer with words, but he reached out, just for a moment, and touched her shoulder. A brief pressure, there and gone like wind through grass. Then he stood, knocked the ash from his pipe against the porch rail, and went inside. Clara sat alone in the gathering darkness, listening to the night sounds settle over the ridge. Crickets beginning their chorus. An owl calling from somewhere in the pines. The distant rush of the creek she had knelt beside on her first day here, a lifetime ago. She thought about Ridgeway, about Mrs. Harmon's sharp voice and the saloon cook's laughter, and Silas Greer's ledger with its list of debts she had not been able to pay. They all seemed very far away now, like stories about someone else. Clara looked at the gold coins in her hand, felt their weight, their promise. For the first time since her father died and left her with nothing but his debts and his shame, she had something that was hers alone, something no one could take away. She closed her fingers around the coins and held them tight. Then, from down the ridge, she heard hoofbeats, not fading away this time, coming closer, fast. 3 horses, maybe 4, moving hard. Clara's hand went still. The coins bit into her palm. It was nearly dark. No one climbed the ridge this late, not unless they had business that could not wait for morning. She stood, looked toward the tree line, where the trail emerged from the pines, and in the last gray light of evening, she saw them. 3 riders. Coming hard up the slope, she recognized the horse in front, a roan gelding with a white blaze on its chest. Tom Pruitt's horse. The same animal that had stood tied outside the Ridgeway Saloon on the day Clara had been laughed out of the kitchen. The past had found her. The riders pulled up at the edge of the clearing just as the last light bled from the sky. Tom Pruitt sat the roan gelding with the easy slouch of a man who had never worked a day he did not choose. Behind him, Earl Danvers on a spotted mare, and a third man Clara did not recognize, younger, thinner, holding a leather satchel against his chest, like it contained something precious. Pruitt's eyes found Clara on the porch, his lips pulled back in something that was not quite a smile. "There she is," he said. "The Danby girl. Heard you'd run up here to hide." Clara's fingers tightened on the porch rail. The gold coins from Margaret Holloway were still in her other hand, pressing half-moon shapes into her palm. The cabin door opened behind her. Croy stepped out, rifle cradled in his arms. He said nothing, just stood there, solid and silent as the ridge itself. Pruitt's gaze shifted to the old man, then back to Clara. "We're not here for trouble, Croy. Just business. Business with her." "State it." Pruitt jerked his chin toward the man with the satchel. "Show her." The thin man dismounted, walked toward the porch with steps that were too quick, too eager. He pulled papers from the satchel, yellowed at the edges. Covered in dense handwriting Clara could not read from this distance. A wax seal at the bottom. Cracked, but still visible. "Your daddy's debts," Pruitt said from his horse. "Henry Danby. Owed money all over Ridgeway when he died. Owed me. Owed Earl. Owed half the merchants in town." He leaned forward in his saddle, leather creaking. "Someone's got to pay." Clara took the papers with hands that had started to tremble. She recognized her father's name at the top, his signature at the bottom, or something that looked like it. Numbers and dates and amounts that made her head swim. "I didn't sign these," she said. "Doesn't matter. You're his kin. Only kin he had left. Debts passed down." "That's not law." Pruitt's smile widened, showing teeth stained brown from chewing tobacco. "Maybe not in some fancy courthouse back east, but out here debts get paid, one way or another." Croy shifted his weight. The rifle did not move, but his voice came out low and rough as gravel. "You got business here, not a question." Pruitt spread his hands wide, playing innocent. "Just collecting what's owed. The girl can come back to Ridgeway, work off the debt. Plenty of places need help. The hotel, the laundry." His eyes moved over Clara's body, slow and deliberate. "She can scrub floors on her knees until she's square." The words landed like a slap across her face. Clara saw it, the years stretching ahead like a tunnel with no end. On her knees in Ridgeway, washing other people's dirt, while Mrs. Harmon whispered to customers about the Danby girl, who could not escape her father's shame. Scrubbing until her hands cracked and bled. Scrubbing until there was nothing left of her but the stain of a name she had not chosen. "I'm not going back. You don't have a choice." Pruitt's voice hardened, all pretense of friendliness gone. "These papers are legal. Sheriff Tate's seen them. He'll be up here in 3 days to enforce collection if you don't come willing." The thin man stepped closer to the porch. His eyes moved over Clara's worn dress, her calloused hands. The apron stained with flour and berry juice from the cake she had baked. "You've been hiding up here," he said, "living off this old man's charity, while honest folks in Ridgeway wait for what they're owed." Something cracked inside Clara's chest. She looked at the papers in her trembling hands, at her father's name printed there in ink that had faded but not disappeared. Henry Danby. The man who had taught her to cook before the whiskey took him. The man who had sat at their kitchen table night after night, bottle in hand, while the debts piled up and the shame grew too heavy to speak about. She had thought she had escaped him, thought she had climbed high enough that his shadow could not reach her. But here it was, crawling up the ridge to drag her back down into the mud. "I was 17 when he died," Clara said. Her voice sounded strange in her own ears, thin and distant, like it belonged to someone else. "I signed nothing. I owe nothing." "That's not what these papers say." Pruitt swung down from his horse, walked toward the porch with the slow confidence of a man who knew he held every card that mattered. "Your daddy borrowed money, spent it on whiskey and cards and women who weren't your mama, left you with nothing but his name and his debts." He stopped at the bottom of the steps, close enough that Clara could smell the tobacco on his breath. "You think you can run from that? Think you can hide up here cooking for drifters and pretend you're somebody worth knowing?" He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded newspaper, tossed it at Clara's feet. "That's from 2 weeks ago, Ridgeway Gazette. Mrs. Harmon wrote a letter to the editor about you, about how the Danby girl ran off without paying her rent, about how she's a thief and a liar, just like her daddy was." Clara stared at the newspaper lying on the porch boards. She did not pick it up, did not need to. Thief, liar, just like her daddy. The words settled into her bones like poison. "I paid my rent," she said, but her voice had no strength left in it. "Every week until there was nothing left." "That's not what Silas Greer says. He says you owe him 3 weeks. Pruitt shrugged, enjoying himself now. "Doesn't matter what's true. Matters what people believe. And they believe you're a thief, Clara Danby. They believe you're your father's daughter through and through." Clara's legs went weak. She reached for the porch rail, felt the rough wood bite into her palm. All those weeks of work, all those meals prepared with care, the garden she had planted, the cellar she had organized, the wedding cake that had made Margaret Holloway cry with gratitude. None of it mattered. Not to these men, not to Ridgeway. She was still the Danby girl, still the fat daughter of the town drunk, still nobody worth remembering except as a cautionary tale. "Well?" Pruitt's voice cut through the fog filling her head. "You coming down with us? Or do we wait for the sheriff?" Clara looked at Croy. The old man stood motionless, rifle in his hands, his face carved from the same stone as the ridge itself. But his eyes, something moved in them. Something that might have been anger, or pity, or nothing at all. He did not speak. Of course he did not. Why would he? She was a stranger who had shown up on his porch 2 months ago begging for scraps. He owed her nothing. She had no claim on him. No right to expect his protection. The silence stretched until it seemed to fill the entire clearing. Pruitt laughed a short, ugly sound. "That's what I thought. The old hermit knows better than to stick his neck out for a Danby." Clara's hand opened. The gold coins fell from her palm, scattered across the porch boards with bright, mocking sounds. Margaret Holloway's payment. The first money she had ever truly earned. rolling away into the cracks between the planks. Pruitt's eyes dropped to the coins. His smile grew wider. "Well now," he said, "looks like you've got something to start paying with." He climbed the first step, then the second. Clara watched him come. Her body had gone numb, her thoughts slow and thick as cold molasses. This was it. This was how it ended. Dragged back to Ridgeway, back to the whispers and the pointing fingers, back to the life she had fled. Pruitt reached for the coins. Croy's voice stopped him cold. "That money's not yours." Pruitt looked up. Croy had moved just one step forward, but the rifle was no longer cradled casually. It was level now, the barrel pointing somewhere between Pruitt's chest and the porch where he stood. "Stay out of this, old man. She earned that money, earned it with her own two hands." Croy's voice was rust and gravel, but steady as the mountains behind him. "You want to collect debts. You do it through the law, not by taking what doesn't belong to you." The sheriff. "3 days. You said, come back with him then. We'll sort it out proper." Croy took another step forward. "Until then, get off my land." Pruitt's face darkened. His hand moved toward the pistol, holstered at his belt. Earl Danvers spoke for the first time from his horse. "Tom, don't." The thin man with the satchel had already retreated, backing toward his horse with quick, nervous steps. Even the animals seemed uneasy, shifting and snorting in the fading light. Pruitt held Croy's gaze for a long moment. His jaw worked like he was chewing on something bitter he could not quite swallow. Then he spat into the dirt and stepped back down off the porch. 3 days, he said. Sheriff Tate will be here with a warrant, and we'll see how tough you are then, old man. He mounted his horse and jerked the reins hard enough to make the animal shy sideways. The 3 riders turned and headed back toward the trail, swallowed by the darkness within moments. Clara stood on the porch, her whole body trembling. The gold coins still lay scattered at her feet. She could not make herself bend down to pick them up. Croy lowered the rifle. He looked at her, and for once, his expression was something she could almost read. "Inside," he said. "Now." Clara followed him into the cabin on legs that barely held her weight. Her hands hung useless at her sides, shaking with something that felt like cold even though the night was warm. Croy closed the door and latched it, leaned the rifle against the wall, then he turned to face her. "Those papers," he said. "Let me see them." Clara realized she was still holding them, crumpled now in her fist. She thrust them toward him, wanting them out of her hands, out of her sight, out of her life. Croy carried them to the table and spread them flat under the oil lamp. His eyes moved across the pages slowly, carefully, reading every line. Clara sank into a chair. Her body felt hollow, scraped clean of everything that had made her feel strong these past weeks. Thief. Liar. Just like her daddy. The words echoed in her skull, louder than her own heartbeat. "This signature," Croy said. He tapped the paper with one rough finger. "This your daddy's hand." Clara looked. The letters swam before her eyes like fish in muddy water. "I don't know. It looks like it could be, or it could be a forgery. I can't tell anymore." "And this date here, October of last year?" Clara's breath caught. She leaned forward, looked at where his finger rested. October 15th. "He was dead by October," she said. Her voice cracked on the words. Died in August. I buried him myself. She reached into her apron pocket without thinking, pulled out the folded paper she had carried with her since Ridgeway. Her father's death certificate, signed by Dr. Marsden. The date clear and undeniable, August 23rd. Croy took the certificate, held it next to the debt papers, compared the dates. They forged this, he said. It was not a question. They could have, or maybe he signed something before he got sick and they changed the date later. I don't know. Clara's throat closed around the words. Does it matter? They have papers? They have the sheriff? They have nothing? Croy straightened, his jaw set hard. A dead man can't sign a debt 2 months after he's buried. Any judge worth his salt would throw this out. There's no judge in Ridgeway, that's fraud. Just Sheriff Tate. And he plays cards with Tom Pruitt every Saturday night. Croy looked at her. The lamp cast deep shadows across his face, turned his eyes into dark pools that gave nothing away. Then we don't play by Ridgeway rules. Clara stared at him. What do you mean? But Croy did not answer. He folded the papers, both the forged debt and the death certificate, and tucked them into his shirt pocket. Then he walked to the door. Get some sleep, he said with his hand on the latch. Tomorrow, we send word to the valley. To who? The old man paused. When he spoke again, his voice carried something Clara had not heard before, something that might have been hope, or might have been the beginning of a plan. To everyone who's ever eaten at your table. He opened the door and stepped out into the darkness. Clara sat alone in the lamplight, her father's name still burning behind her eyes. 3 days. She had 3 days to prove she was more than Henry Danby's daughter. 3 days to prove she deserved to stay on this ridge. And somewhere down that dark trail, hoofbeats faded into silence, carrying men who would return with the full weight of Ridgeway's judgment behind them. The third morning came with clouds the color of old bruises. Clara stood at the window, watching the ridge trail. Her hands were raw from 2 days of work cooking for the people who had answered Croy's call, cleaning, preparing. Danny Morrow had ridden down the mountain the morning after Pruitt's visit, carrying messages to everyone whose name appeared in Clara's ledger. Now there was nothing left to do but wait. They had come. Not all of them, but enough. Frank Morrow sat on the porch with his bad leg stretched out, his rifle across his knees. Danny stood beside the lean-to, checking the horses. Ezekiel the trapper leaned against the woodpile, his white beard catching the gray morning light. Margaret Holloway had sent her husband Samuel, who sat in Clara's chair with the quiet stillness of a man who had faced trouble before and knew how to wait for it. Others too, Ruth Patterson and her sister, the prospector Holt, who had traded coffee beans for stew. The family heading west who had stayed 2 nights the father had come back alone, leaving his wife and children safe in the valley below. 12 people. 12 witnesses. But would it matter against the weight of Ridgeway's judgment? Clara turned from the window. Croy sat at the table, the forged papers spread before him alongside her father's death certificate. He had studied them for 2 days, marking passages with a pencil stub, making notes in cramped handwriting on the margins. They're coming, Clara said. Croy looked up. I know. He folded the papers carefully, slipped them into his shirt pocket, stood. His movements were slower than they had been when she first arrived. Or maybe she was only noticing now because everything felt like it was moving too fast. Whatever happens, he said, you stand your ground. You hear me? Clara nodded. Her throat was too tight for words. Croy walked to the door, opened it, and stepped onto the porch. Clara followed. The hoofbeats reached them before the riders appeared steady and deliberate. Climbing the ridge trail. 3 horses at first, then 4, then 5. Sheriff Tate rode in front, a man in his 50s, heavy in the saddle, with a badge that caught what little light the clouds allowed. Behind him came Tom Pruitt and Earl Danvers, the thin man with the leather satchel, and a 5th rider Clara did not recognize at first, a woman in a dark dress, her face hidden beneath a plain bonnet. The riders stopped at the edge of the clearing. Sheriff Tate's eyes moved over the people gathered around the cabin. His expression did not change, but something shifted in the set of his shoulders. This was not what he had expected to find. "Wasn't expecting a crowd," he said. Croy stepped to the edge of the porch. "Wasn't expecting you to bring one either." The sheriff dismounted and handed his reins to the thin man. He walked toward the cabin with the slow deliberation of a man who wanted everyone to see him coming, to understand the weight of the law he carried. "I'm here on official business," he said. "Got papers saying Clara Danby owes debts to citizens of Ridgeway. Papers signed by her father before he died." "Her father died in August," Croy said. "Those papers are dated October." Tate paused. His eyes flicked to Pruitt, still mounted on the roan gelding, then back to Croy. "That's so. Check for yourself." Croy pulled the papers from his pocket and held them out. The sheriff took them, unfolded them, studied the date and signature. His jaw tightened by degrees as he read. "Tom," he said without looking up, "you told me these were legitimate." Pruitt shifted in his saddle. "They are legitimate. Henry Danby signed them himself. I watched him do it. In October. Must have been September. Got the date wrong is all." "September?" Croy said. "When Henry Danby was bedridden with the fever that killed him. When he couldn't hold a pen. Couldn't hardly hold up his own head." Clara stepped forward. Her legs trembled beneath her skirt, but she forced them steady, forced her voice to come out clear. "I nursed him those last weeks," she said. "I watched him die. He signed nothing after August. He couldn't have." She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out the death certificate, the paper she had carried with her since Ridgeway, not knowing why she could not leave it behind. Now she understood. "Dr. Marsden signed this, August 23rd. She held it out to the sheriff. "Check the date yourself." Tate took the certificate, compared it to the debt papers, held both up to the gray morning light. The silence stretched across the clearing like a held breath. "Tom," the sheriff said finally. His voice had gone flat and hard. "This is forgery." "That's not. This is forgery." Tate's voice rose, cracking the morning stillness. "You brought me up here on a forgery. Made me ride 3 hours up this ridge. Made me look like a fool in front of—" He gestured at the people gathered around the cabin, in front of half the valley. Pruitt's face had gone the color of old brick. He swung down from his horse, strode toward the porch with his hands balled into fists at his sides. "Now hold on just a minute. That girl owes money. Her father. Her father is dead?" The voice came from behind the riders. Margaret Holloway had arrived without Clara noticing, riding up from the back trail with 2 men from her ranch. She dismounted and walked through the clearing to stand beside Clara on the porch. "His debts died with him," Margaret said. "That's the law. Sheriff, you know it as well as anyone here." Tate looked at Margaret, at Samuel, at Frank Morrow with his rifle, at the 12 people who had come to stand with a cook they barely knew. Something shifted in his expression. The hard certainty that had carried him up the ridge began to crumble, leaving only a tired man with a badge that suddenly seemed heavier than it had that morning. "Tom," he said quietly. "Earl, get back on your horses." But now, Pruitt stood frozen at the bottom of the porch steps. His eyes darted from the sheriff to Clara to Croy and back again. His hands opened and closed at his sides like he was searching for something to grab hold of. "This isn't over," he said. "You think these people will always protect you? You think it's over?" The voice came from behind Pruitt. The woman in the dark dress had dismounted and was walking toward the porch. As she moved, she pushed back her bonnet. Clara's breath stopped in her chest. "Mrs. Harmon." The general store owner walked with the stiff gait of someone who had not slept in days. Her face was pale, her eyes rimmed red. She climbed the porch steps and stopped in front of Clara. "I wrote that letter," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "To the newspaper. Calling you a thief?" Clara said nothing. Her hands had gone cold. "I wrote it because Tom Pruitt asked me to. Because he said your father owed him money. And you had run off without paying? Because—" Mrs. Harmon's voice cracked. "Because I believed him. Because it was easier than thinking about what I had done to you." She reached into her bag and pulled out a bundle of papers tied with string. "He sent me letters," she said. "Instructions on what to write and how to write it. I kept them all." She held the bundle out to the sheriff. "It's here. Everything he did. Everything he asked me to do." Tate took the papers. "Read them." His jaw tightened with each page he turned. "Tom Pruitt," he said finally, "you're coming back to Ridgeway with me. For what? Forgery. Fraud. Conspiracy." Tate folded the letters and tucked them into his coat. "You'll answer to a judge in the county seat? A real judge?" Pruitt's hand moved toward his pistol. Frank Morrow stood. His rifle came up, not pointed at anyone, just present. "Don't," Frank said quietly. Pruitt's hand stopped. His eyes darted around the clearing at the sheriff, at the armed men, at the witnesses watching him with cold, steady gazes. His shoulders sagged. "This isn't justice," he said, but his voice had lost its edge. "Maybe not," Tate said, "but it's the law." He turned to Earl Danvers. "Tie his hands. We're taking him down to town." Danvers hesitated. He looked at Pruitt, his friend, his partner in this scheme, and something moved across his face. Shame, maybe. Or the first stirring of it. "I didn't know about the forgery," he said quietly to the sheriff. "I swear I didn't." "Then you can testify to that in court." Tate's voice held no sympathy. "Now tie his hands." Danvers pulled rope from his saddlebag, walked to Pruitt, bound his wrists with hands that trembled slightly. Pruitt did not resist, but his eyes stayed on Clara, burning with a hatred that made her skin crawl even from 10 feet away. He said nothing. They loaded him onto his horse and tied the reins to Tate's saddle. The thin man with the satchel had already fled, his horse disappearing down the ridge trail before anyone thought to stop him. Sheriff Tate mounted his horse. He looked at Clara, then at Croy, then at the people gathered around the cabin. "I owe you an apology," he said to Clara. "I should have checked those papers before I rode up here." Clara nodded. She did not trust her voice. Tate turned his horse and rode away, Pruitt's mount trailing behind. Earl Danvers followed, his head down, his shoulders hunched against the weight of what he had helped set in motion. Mrs. Harmon remained. She stood on the porch, her bonnet pushed back, her hands empty now that she had given away her evidence. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said quietly. I wouldn't forgive me either. Clara looked at this woman who had whispered about her, who had turned her away, who had written lies for a man with a grudge. Why did you come? Clara asked. Mrs. Harmon was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible. Because I couldn't sleep, she said. Because every time I closed my eyes, I saw you walking away from my store. And I remembered what my mother used to tell me, that a person's worth shows in how they treat the people nobody's watching them treat. She looked at Clara with eyes that held no expectation. I treated you like you were nothing. And I was wrong. Clara's throat ached. She thought of all the things she could say, the anger, the hurt, the months of shame that had driven her up this ridge. Instead, she said, the road down is rough. You should start before the weather turns. Mrs. Harmon blinked. Then she nodded slowly. Thank you, she said, for not... She stopped. Just thank you. She walked to her horse, mounted with difficulty, and rode away. The clearing fell silent. Clara stood on the porch, surrounded by people who had ridden through the night to stand with her. Margaret Holloway, Frank Morrow, Ezekiel, Ruth, Samuel, all of them. And Croy. The old man stood beside her, his rifle lowered now. He looked at her, and for the first time since she had known him, he smiled. It was a small smile, barely there, gone almost before she could see it, but it was real. Well, he said, that's done. Clara looked at the ridge trail, empty now except for dust settling in the morning light, at the people who had come for her, at the cabin that had become her home. Yes, she said, it's done. Frank Morrow stepped forward and stretched his bad leg. You fed us, he said simply. We showed up. That's how it works out here. Margaret Holloway took Clara's hands in her own. No, Margaret said. That's how it works when someone is worth showing up for. Clara's eyes burned. She blinked hard, looked away toward the mountains. The clouds were breaking apart. Through the gaps, she could see blue sky. Pale sunlight touched the ridge, turned the pines to green and gold. The first clear sky in 3 days. And somewhere deep in Clara's chest, something that had been clenched tight for months began to loosen. Autumn came to Bear Ridge with the smell of wood smoke and dying leaves. Clara stood at the kitchen window, watching the morning light spread across the valley below. The glass was cold against her fingertips. Frost had touched the edges during the night, leaving patterns that caught the early sun like something delicate and temporary. Behind her, the stove crackled with fresh-fed flames. The smell of baking bread filled the cabin, yeast and wheat, and the faint sweetness of honey she had traded for 2 weeks ago when Ezekiel came through with his winter pelts. 3 months since Pruitt's arrest. 3 months since Mrs. Harmon had stood on this porch and spoken words that Clara still did not know how to hold. The world had shifted in those months. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in small ways that added up to something Clara was only beginning to understand. She turned from the window and surveyed her kitchen. It was larger now. Croy had built the extension in September, working without explanation or announcement, adding a second window and more counter space and shelves that ran floor to ceiling along the back wall. The fresh-cut lumber still smelled of pine sap when the stove heated the room. He had said nothing about it, just built it, and Clara had filled it with the tools of her trade. Cast iron pans blackened with use, ceramic bowls in 3 sizes, jars of preserved vegetables and dried herbs, each one labeled in her careful handwriting. The good flour that Margaret Holloway sent up from the valley every 2 weeks. Clara's kitchen. That was what people called it now. The name had spread through the valley like water finding its level, carried by travelers and trappers, and the steady stream of visitors who climbed the ridge for a meal. Some came for the food, others came for the company, for the warmth of the cabin, for the quiet that seemed to settle over everyone who sat at Clara's table. She had stopped counting the visitors weeks ago. There were too many to track. The ledger she had started in summer now filled 3 notebooks, each page covered with names and dates and trades, a record of everyone who had passed through and what they had left behind. Ruth Patterson had visited twice more since the confrontation with Pruitt. She brought news from the valley each time how Ridgway was talking, how folks were looking at each other differently now that the forgery had come to light, how Silas Greer had closed his livery stable and moved to another town, unable to face the neighbors who knew what he had done. Danny Morrow had come up 3 times, always with questions about biscuits and bread and the proper way to season a cast iron pan. His mother had sent a letter last month, thanking Clara for teaching her son to cook. He made Sunday dinner. The letter read, "First time in his life. It was not perfect, but he tried. That is because of you." Clara had kept the letter. It sat in a wooden box beside her bed, along with other things she had collected, a pressed flower from Ruth, a carved wooden spoon from Ezekiel, a blue ribbon that Margaret's daughter Eleanor had sent after the wedding, and the 3 gold coins. She had picked them up from the porch boards after Pruitt rode away, had held them in her palm until the metal warmed, had put them in the box where they would stay until she decided what to do with them. Small things, but they added up to a life. The bread was ready. Clara pulled the loaves from the oven, set them on the cooling rack she had fashioned from scrap wood and wire. The crusts were golden brown, cracked in all the right places. Steam rose from the splits, carrying that smell she never tired of. She cut a slice, spread it with butter from the crock by the window, and carried it out to the porch. Croy was there, as he always was in the mornings now. He sat in the chair she had given him, the good one, with the cushion she had sewn from the blue calico. His pipe rested unlit in his hand. He was watching the ridge, watching the trail that wound down toward the valley. A dog lay at his feet, a brown mutt with one torn ear that had appeared 2 weeks ago, following Holt the prospector up the trail and refusing to follow him back down. Croy had not wanted it at first. Now he saved scraps from every meal. Clara handed him the bread. He took it without looking, bit into it, chewed slowly. "Good," he said. 1 word. But from Croy, it meant everything. Clara sat in her own chair, the one she had dragged from the storage room all those months ago, worn now from daily use, as familiar as her own hands. The morning air was cool against her face. She could smell pine and wood smoke and the faint sweetness of the bread. "Someone's coming," Croy said. Clara looked. A figure on the trail, still distant, moving slowly upward. A single rider on a dark horse. "I will start coffee," she said. She went inside, put the kettle on, measured grounds into the pot. Through the window, she watched the rider approach. The horse was familiar, a bay mare with a white blaze. But the rider was not Margaret Holloway. Clara wiped her hands on her apron and went back to the porch. The rider was a young woman, maybe 20, with dark hair pulled back under a plain bonnet. She dismounted at the edge of the clearing and walked toward the cabin with uncertain steps. "Miss Danby," she called. "Clara?" Clara said. "Just Clara." The young woman climbed the porch steps, up close. Clara could see the redness around her eyes, the tension in her jaw. "I am Anna," she said. "Anna Greer, Silas Greer's daughter." Clara's stomach tightened. The landlord who had given her until Friday. The man who had lied about her rent. "I know who you are," Clara said carefully. Anna's hands twisted together in front of her. "I came to apologize. For my father. For what he did to you." Clara waited. "He lied about the rent. You paid him every week. I found the receipts in his desk after everything came out about Mr. Pruitt." Anna's voice cracked. "He lied because Pruitt owed him money from cards. Pruitt said he would forgive the debt if my father backed up the story about you." Clara's hands had gone cold. She pressed them against her apron. "Does your father know you are here?" "No." Anna's chin lifted slightly. "He would not want me to come, but I could not let it stand. What they did to you." She reached into her coat and pulled out a folded paper. "The receipts," she said. "All of them. Proof that you paid what you owed. I thought you should have them." Clara took the paper, unfolded it. There they were, her own handwriting, dates and amounts, Silas Greer's signature at the bottom of each one. "Thank you," Clara said. Anna nodded. She turned to go, then stopped. "My father is not well," she said quietly. "The shame is eating at him. He cannot sleep, cannot face people." She paused. "He asked me to tell you he is sorry. He could not say it himself, but he wanted you to know." Clara looked at the receipts in her hand. At this young woman who had ridden up the ridge to deliver an apology her father could not speak. "Tell him I heard," Clara said. "Tell him that is enough." Anna's eyes glistened. She mounted her horse and rode away. Clara watched her go until the trail swallowed her. Then she went inside and put the receipts in the wooden box with the coins and the letters and all the other small things that added up to proof that she had been here, had mattered, had left a mark. The afternoon brought more visitors. Frank Morrow arrived with Danny and 2 other hunters, their saddlebags full of venison. Ruth Patterson came with her sister, carrying jars of honey and a bolt of cloth the color of autumn leaves. Ezekiel appeared from the tree line, silent as always, bearing rabbits and a rare smile. Clara cooked. She cooked until her arms ached and her feet throbbed, and the kitchen was full of steam and the smell of roasting meat, venison stew, turkey pie, biscuits that disappeared as fast as she could pull them from the oven. The cabin filled with voices and laughter and the clink of tin cups against the table. When the food was gone and the visitors had drifted toward sleep or the trail home, Clara stepped outside. The evening was cool and clear. Stars were beginning to appear, faint pinpricks in the darkening sky. The ridge stretched away below her, a vast emptiness that no longer felt empty. Croy was on the porch, his pipe glowing in the darkness. The dog lay at his feet, already asleep. Clara sat beside him. They did not speak. They did not need to. After a while, Croy reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of paper, handed it to Clara. She unfolded it, tilting it toward the lamplight from the window. A letter. From Mrs. Harmon. "Dear Miss Danby," it read, "I am writing to ask if you would consider providing baked goods for the Ridgeway General Store. Several customers have asked about your bread and pastries. I would pay fair prices and display your name. I understand if you refuse, but I wanted to ask sincerely, Sarah Harmon." Clara read it twice. "What do you think?" she asked Croy. The old man puffed on his pipe. Smoke curled into the night air. "I think it is your choice," he said. "Always has been." Clara folded the letter and put it in her apron pocket. She thought about Ridgeway, the saloon where the cook had laughed at her, the general store where Mrs. Harmon had whispered, the livery stable and the water pump, and all the places where she had been seen and dismissed. She thought about the girl who had climbed this ridge with 17 cents and a broken carpet bag. That girl was gone. In her place was a woman with calloused hands and a kitchen full of people who chose to stand with her. A woman who had faced men who wanted to drag her through the mud and had remained standing. She would write back to Mrs. Harmon. She would say, "Come to the ridge. Bring your own sugar." But not tonight. Tonight she would sit on this porch with this man who had given her a chance. She would watch the stars appear and feel the cool air and listen to the silence of the ridge she had claimed. Tomorrow she would knead bread, feed whoever climbed the trail, build something that was hers. Croy knocked the ash from his pipe, stood slowly. "Coming in?" he asked. Clara shook her head. "In a minute." He touched her shoulder once, then went inside. Clara sat alone, wrapped in darkness and quiet. Through the window, she could see her kitchen, the stove, the shelves, the bread cooling on the rack, the life she had made. She stood, stretched, felt her muscles settle. Behind her, the ridge fell away into night. Before her, lamplight and warmth. Clara opened the door and stepped inside.